welcome this morning to another one of our webinar series. Many of you will have seen others that we've done, and perhaps saw the last one that John Esder, one of my colleagues, did on this topic. So welcome to our latest Brexit webinar. We're joined by a number of colleagues and some special guests as well. So if I just introduce you to the panels this morning, it's members of my commercial team, partner John Esder, Senior Associate Rachel Atherton, and Associate Claire Hines, who can help guide us through some of the legal aspects of the great Brexit debate. And we're also joined by Angela Barnes, who's a Senior Associate here in our employment team, to cover off those aspects. So those guys are going to deal with any issues we've got around that. We're very lucky also to have two guests. Rebecca Akuda from KPMG, who is Head of Trade and Customs there, who's going to give us a slightly different perspective, and I'm sure some useful insight into some of the hot topics around Brexit at the moment. And James Sloan from the CBI's EU negotiations team, who is very much at the forefront of some of the discussions about shaping the debate and the future relationship with the EU. So welcome everybody, and welcome to our guests as well. As ever, we'll try and keep this fairly informal, so I very much hope it's a conversation. If you've got any questions, please feel free to drop them. We'll try and deal them as the webinar is in progress or at the end. If there's anything that can't be dealt with on the call, please get in touch with us and we'll do our best to try and find an answer for you. So really, the purpose of the webinar this morning is to just catch up on the Brexit debate. We've talked about COVID for a long, long time and forgotten that this huge topic that occupied most of the last 5 years hasn't gone away. We signed the Trading Cooperation Agreement in December, on the 30th of December. And obviously, since then, there's been a few little hiccups along the road. We won't forget the sort of phony war about vaccines in Northern Ireland, and everyone will have stories, as we were talking before the webinar, about online shopping issues, whether you're paying customs because you've got a coat sent to a friend or a relative in Europe, or just actually having issues with goods getting through. So what we thought we'd try and do is just try and make sense of where we are, try and put some thoughts together about where we might go, and hopefully come up with some tips around how we can maybe help you through some of the challenges that you'll be facing. So I think what I'd like to do really is just start with a conversation. Perhaps James can take this one. Northern Ireland's been a sort of the vanguard really of any Brexit issues. It seemed to be the issue that everyone forgot about when we were voting to leave. It was a massive source of controversy through the withdrawal process, and only recently it's probably been the first major front line in terms of how we're doing it. So just be useful for your perspective. It's interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's anyone who thinks Brexit is done just needs to look across the water to Northern Ireland and realise that it is far from done. As you picked up there, the COVID vaccine thing really did kick things off. That was what, 2-3 weeks ago now, when the European Commission triggered Article 16, and therefore to cut sort of some of the boring jargon around that, basically that would have prevented Northern Ireland from sending products into Great Britain, and that would have caused quite a lot of concern. And that therefore is actually only what, 7 weeks into the New Deal, has essentially reopened up the political argument, certainly around the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's worth saying that a lot of our members in Northern Ireland, they've been clear since the protocol started. It's the only effective thing we can use right now to keep business moving. There is no alternative to the protocol. We hear quite a lot of talk about, technical solutions of using computers, whatever. Nothing like that is really in the offing right now. It's fair to say, though, that the protocol is going to be a political football and will continue to be a political football. For those in the call, some of you who do trade with Northern Ireland, you might know there are grace periods for certain aspects of it, so not everything was actually in full action to begin with. However, Michael Gove did write to the Commission after that happened to say, right, come on guys, let's talk about this again. So there are currently ongoing talks between him and his counterpart Sivkovic, I think that's how you pronounce his name, in the Commission, looking at what can be done to ease movement of goods. For example, it's stuff we don't necessarily think about. So, for example, fresh meat products going into Northern Ireland, actually, it's a lot more difficult. If you're based in GB and you're a GB supermarket going into Northern Ireland, it's an awful lot more difficult to get that through. There are additional health certificates, additional checks at what the UK government is not referring to as a border, but is in all intent purposes an internal border. Also, because of the fallout from Article 16 a few weeks ago, a number of staff were withdrawn from sites in Northern Ireland. There's this idea, though, that the lorries that were going into Northern Ireland were all of a sudden just going in, and that was a free-for-all. It's not the case. Whilst lorries may not have been having physical checks that are now part of the agreement, all the paperwork that firms need to do was still very much being checked. Worth saying that sort of this time next year, the Northern Ireland Assembly will be heading to elections, and therefore I don't see the protocol dying down as an issue anytime this year.
No, thanks. And one of the things, obviously, we're lawyers in the main on this call, but one of the things that is probably of most interest to people is actually the practicalities of some of these things. And Northern Ireland appears to be the kind of exemplar of everything that can go wrong and will go wrong. And you mentioned the sort of political footballs. How much of that do you think still left to play out? Because I think a lot of people thought that this was the start of things being normalised. Do you think we're going to get any sense of normality anytime soon?
What is normality? That's a very good question. Look, the Commission have said that the protocol isn't up for grabs anymore. The protocol is there. Yes, they can look at ways to tweak it, but then the politicians might not quite agree with that. And the DUP are. We've seen latest polls, they're not looking great in terms of their support. Their support is drifting away on one side to the Alliance Party, on the other side to more the TUV, I believe they're called, more extreme element perhaps of Ulster Unionism. So there's a lot of politics at play here. And I honestly don't see that changing anytime soon. The unfortunate thing, though, is that business still needs to keep trading and business still needs to keep moving. And we keep saying that to anyone who'll listen. That business needs to make this work, and they want to make it work, and I think there's actually a good news story about Northern Ireland because of its sort of existing position within the UK internal market, but also within the EU customs rules, and actually sort of making Northern Ireland as a unique place to do business. But right now, I think it's just going to spend the next sort of few months trying to work out what it means. And worth saying as well, that a lot of Northern Irish firms were relatively prepared for this. It was actually firms in Great Britain that were less prepared for this, as to be expected. And some are now taking decisions not to trade into Northern Ireland. We believe only temporarily, but yeah, it's going to be like this, I think, for the next few months at least.
Fine. Well, you mentioned the fact we need to get business done. So I'd like to talk a little bit about supply chain now and how some of the things that people are seeing and maybe some of the things that they're going to come down the track. And Rebecca, perhaps be really interested to hear some of the things that you're seeing in respect of how supply chains are working, some of the challenges they're facing.
Yeah, I mean, how long have you got? I've got about 1,000 examples at the moment on supply chain. Perhaps if I break it down into just a few key points. So I think that probably the first reflection is in the first 2 months, what we've seen from our clients, but also based on surveys, is that on the export side of things, so UK or GB to the EU, there were significant delays probably caused in respect of those goods moving under transit. And I think this has probably been caused by people not understanding whether or not they need to use transit. So if I just give you an example, so we have a client and they move goods from their GB warehouse and they send them out into Belgium, but they travel via France. Now, they're not VAT registered in France. So when they hit that first border, if they were going to clear the goods into France, they would have suffered kind of irrecoverable import VAT potentially because they're not VAT registered there. Equally, they couldn't find a fiscal representative, and even if they did, it was very, very expensive in order to get that. So the solution for them was to move goods under transit. It effectively allows you to move the goods from GB all the way across all the different member states, and customs clear them into that final country of destination. So from a tax perspective, it was the best solution. Now, when it comes to transit, first of all, they had to negate that they didn't have a transit guarantee. So they had to find a third party willing to do that. Then they had the additional issue about lead times. So they had to deliver the goods in X amount of time. But the issues they had was that first and foremost, they needed to make sure that they did an export declaration in the UK. So they needed that MRN number to give to the driver. Then they had to open an LRN. Because they're not an authorised consignee, consignor, they couldn't do that at their own premises. So the driver then has to go to a customs office to open that transit movement, get the paperwork. Then at the same time, they also have to do an advanced import declaration into France. The driver also needs that. The driver also has to log into different port-based systems, and the same when it gets across onto the other side of the border. So something that was really quite simple becomes really quite complicated, not just for the exporter and the importer, but also for the haulier. So I think a lack of understanding on the process is something that caused some delays in terms of lead times and then being held at the border by customs. So that was just one example. Now, I think that's probably teething problems, and I hope that things will get better on that basis. I think other issues that businesses are starting to be faced with on the export side of things is where their Incoterms have dictated that they need to do the import into the EU, for example. This has caused issues when it comes to indirect representation when you're talking to customs agents in the EU. A lot of the customs agents there either pulled out or withdrew their kind of contractual agreement last minute, late in the day, and we all know how difficult it is to get agents at the moment. So that also caused some delays too. Outside of that, probably regulatory is something that we're seeing issues with, and in some cases is potentially changing some of our client supply chains. So for example, we have businesses who need to satisfy some of the food regulatory requirements, and they simply can't get the certification they require unless they're established within the EU. So businesses are therefore looking at setting up permanent establishments in different member states. And if you think about that and who you're selling to, if you add another party into that transaction, from a food regulatory perspective, you're fine because you get the certification you need. But when you introduce another party into the kind of the transactional flow, from a customs perspective, the valuation positions start to look a bit different. And then the duty you might pay is looking to probably significantly increase based on what you were originally paying. So there's a little bit of restructuring going on for some businesses based on regulatory. But equally, and not to jump too far ahead, the only other thing that I'd probably want to make reference on, not to go down the rules of origin route just yet, is probably also thinking about the way that customers are changing their kind of spending habits or their expectations in terms of next day, same day delivery. Not wanting to have to deal with customers' formalities when it comes to returns as well. So we do have clients and businesses that are looking to set up different distribution centres within the EU and do a bit of a direct ship model from their suppliers from non-EU.
And do you think that's the way out of this for a lot of people, to sort of set up customs warehouses or is there no way out of it just yet? We're just going to have to muddle through until we get some more clarity?
To be honest, it's probably business, product and supply chain specific. We would never say to any business that the way out of this is that you need a separate distribution centre in the EU. I think the starting point has to be that you map your full end-to-end supply chain, you understand the processes that happen in between, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's just a distribution centre. You start to then overlay things like customs warehousing, things like inward processing, different customs reliefs, to really start to understand, actually, is my current supply chain fit for purpose? And if it isn't, you then have to weigh up the cost of moving that supply chain when you look at logistic costs, and you kind of have to get to a decision, actually, what's the most viable kind of option, or what are the options I'm left with? There's so much to do when you look at restructuring supply chains, not just kind of duty and VAT. You've got your corporate tax, transfer pricing. There's a whole heap of things to take into consideration. So I would say no, it's probably specific to supply chain.
No, and of course you don't get that from a government advert, do you? Unfortunately. So, and just hearing you speak there, and your background is from being working for the customs side of things, isn't it? And it looks like you're going to have to use those skills a lot, and I suspect a lot of us are going to have to sort of get familiar with some of that language. I want to come to John in a minute to talk a little bit about supply chains from the legal side, and certainly John has looked into this for us. But Claire, one of the things Rebecca mentioned there was contractual terms, and I thought that debate had ended. I thought that everyone had got themselves sorted, and that this wasn't something that was going to be troubling people in 2021. But it sounds like that might be a slightly naive approach. What are you seeing from clients in that regard?
Still very much seeing interest from clients for clarification on how they can future-proof their contracts, changes that they can make to their standard terms in view of Brexit, and now that we've got a bit more clarification with the agreement, obviously. So I think the broad, the first starting point is the good news story, which is that English contract law hasn't been affected by Brexit. So the good news is that contracting won't be impacted. English contract law isn't derived from EU law. So that's a good news starting point. That said, there are obviously a lot to take into account and to look at. Rebecca's obviously touched on the Incoterms side of things, and it's obviously critically consider what Incoterms are being incorporated into your contract and what you agree to trade on from that perspective. In terms of the agreement itself, kind of things that you need to be looking at are any references to the EU itself. When that was drafted, if you drafted terms a year or so ago, or even more recently than that, you probably anticipated, or it was drafted to include the UK. Obviously, if you want that to continue to be the case, you need to look at some practical steps to make sure that the interpretation of the language is correct. Likewise, you could have reference to compliance with EU legislation in your contracts. So that needs to be looked at on an ongoing basis. You need to make sure that the statutory references are correct and reference the UK implementing and successor legislation as opposed to the strict interpretation of the EU law that you agreed at the time. I think probably the bigger issue, and again, this ties in with everything that Rebecca's been talking about, is the potential for some when you agree your commercial contracts. This is obviously a bigger issue if you're committing to something longer term, any sort of fixed pricing, because now there are obviously other considerations, other costs that you need to factor in potentially. Some of them are apparent already, like Rebecca's mentioned, the additional admin and work in the export side of things, but there could be longer term issues in terms of labour shortages, which I'm sure Angela will probably talk about, potential for currency exchange rate fluctuation, factors that over the coming years could add extra costs in, and that you need to try to build as far as possible contracts where this is possible. So there are still certainly measures you can take.
Thanks, Claire. That's great. It does sound like this is great news for lawyers and accountants, and perhaps not such good news for businesses. But John, I know you've been looking at supply chain issues with clients and separately, and be interested just to get your perspective on what you're seeing and any thoughts you've got on that before we move on to another hot topic, which is around employees and those related issues. So do you want to give us your thoughts on this, John?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I mean, I think as Rebecca said, I mean, it's all very, very not just sector specific, but client specific. And I guess one of the big name points that's come out of that was what we've seen with Nissan, and I guess. Over a number of years, we've seen there's been a lot of concern leading up to the treaty as to what would happen with Nissan. Obviously, emblematic, big employer in the northeast, big part of the UK automotive industry. So there was a lot of concern expressed both locally and by Nissan themselves, and then. We got the announcement, I think about 3 weeks ago now, the very positive announcement that Nissan were committing, at least for the medium term, to stay. And we actually had an interesting statement from the COO of Nissan to say that he actually thought that Nissan had got a competitive advantage from Brexit. And this was interesting because it clearly went against the grain of what a lot of other automotive manufacturers had been saying, and indeed continue to say. And I think it sort of focuses in on the sectors that were both on the fact that Nissan had something that was both sector specific and something specific to them. And I think there were two big points in interplay for them. And the first one was that there was a big win for automotive manufacturers in the agreement, in the trade agreement, and that was that the UK and the EU agreed to align on automotive standards. Of course, one of the big headlines around Brexit have been the ability of the UK to diverge. But in this case, there was a very specific agreement that would not happen, and that both sides would align on standards which are actually set at a UN level. They're set by the UN Commission for Europe. So that made things a lot easier for automotive manufacturers generally, whereas there are going to be some issues, obviously some of the customs issues that we touched on. For an organisation the size of Nissan, they're manageable. And the other issue, the other key issue, relates to rules of origin. Now, Rebecca touched on that very briefly, and she may get yet.
She ran up from it very quickly as well, yeah. John. So I think you've taken the bait there.
I mean, just a very high-level lawyer's understanding of this. What it means is, as I say, headline point from the agreement is that we have a no tariff, no quota agreement between the EU and the UK. But that is subject to what they call rules of origin requirements. And that means that certain percentages of a product's components have to have been made within the EU or the UK. And that has a particularly important effect in the automotive sector, because a lot of their components are being sourced from outside of the UK and the EU, and this is particularly important given the changes within the automotive sector at the moment, where we're seeing the UK has announced that it intends to ban all diesel and petrol vehicles from 2030. So within a pretty short time frame. Big effect of that, well, electric vehicles depend on batteries. Where is the industry sourcing those batteries from at the moment? They're coming from the Far East. And they make up approximately 50% at the moment of the value of the vehicle. How does that intersect with rules of origin? Well, at the moment, at least 40% of a vehicle has to have been made within the UK or the EU. That goes up to 45% in 2023 and to 55% in 2027. So we can see that for the UK automotive industry as a whole, that's a big challenge. If they're going to be able to export to the UK tariff and quota free, what are they going to do about batteries? Well, it means that the industry as a whole has to set up a local supply chain for the production of batteries. That's happening, but obviously there's a timescale to that. So how does that give Nissan this advantage? Well, looking closely, what we can see is that Nissan actually had an existing relationship with a company called Envision, who were a tenant of theirs up in their premises in Sunderland, and that has enabled them to get plans in place to source their batteries from a local supplier who are in the course of setting up. So yes, that has given them an initial very important advantage in that they can source batteries locally at the same time as both their competitors in the UK and their competitors in the EU are struggling to get their supply chains in place. But I think in the medium term, I think that advantage is going to disappear, because there are huge plans afoot, given the background we've talked about, for battery manufacturers to be set up within both the EU and also within the UK. So I think, yes, very, very good news that Nissan is staying, but there are certain specific factors, as I say, which are driving that, and which could potentially create some quite serious problems for Nissan's UK-based competitors.
Thanks. So I mean, my head's hurting a little bit from some of the technicalities around this, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm sure people watching are thinking, crikey, whether you're a Brexiteer or a Remainer, there's just a lot of pain here. But it does sound to me like what I'm hearing is that there are really big opportunities if you can work this stuff out. And James, I think probably be interested to hear from you around that. We're in a part of the world where there is a lot of supply chain companies, automotive, aerospace, a lot of small manufacturers doing fabulous things, but they don't have the critical mass, the size that a Nissan has. They're probably, like many, undercapitalized potentially, and facing the normal business challenges that they face every day. Maybe be interesting to know what help you think there is for those sorts of businesses, where they might turn given the sort of the complexity of all this.
I think before I sort of answer that, I think it's worth saying, from our conversations with businesses over the past few weeks, a number of them are actually looking at the rules of origin now and going, do we actually just take the hit? And in terms of what the actual cost would be on tariffs, and working out whether that hit is worth or costs less to them as a business compared to actually working out what the actual practicalities of either employing new people or actually going through the whole system to work out where they can actually do that. It's worth also adding in there that we've actually had examples of some British businesses struggling to do this because European firms aren't giving them the data that they require to complete their own rules of origin. So I think this year will be a sort of wait and see for a lot of firms trying to work out what they see as a way to do that. In terms of your firms sort of what they can do, I think there is an opportunity. I think you sort of hinted here for UK firms, because there is a potentially essentially a buy British side to this, and a look for firms to expand and to build upon their own knowledge within that area and their own expertise. I think in terms of getting support, I think the government are looking at various ways of helping SMEs particularly, and access additional capital. Of course, this is all in line with what's happening with COVID right now, and we're going to hear next week, I think it is, from the Chancellor with his budget. We'll also hear particularly on that about furlough, whether that will be extended until perhaps May, June time. I think, again, a lot of firms at the moment are just trying to get through the initial, we were saying this a year ago, but they're just trying to get through the COVID period now, working out what that means for them before they can really start thinking about what the longer term business benefits are of the Brexit deal.
No, thank you. And I think it's a world record. We've gone 28 minutes without mentioning COVID. So, and in some respects, that's great because it means we're focusing on moving forward. But in other respects, it probably tells you how much there is to think about with all these changes. Worth also mentioning, and people be aware of this, that actually the agreement we signed in December doesn't really deal with services effectively. And whilst I think that is a large part of the UK economy. I think 80% of our exports to the EU are service-based. I'd just be interested, outside of perhaps a more legal context, in terms of people's views on the City of London, which clearly influences everything. And James, Rebecca, anyone chip in? I saw last month that Amsterdam did more share trading than the City of London for the first time ever. And it feels, from what we're seeing, that there are some hurdles being put in place to stop us competing on that front.
I don't want to be, I'm not a city expert, so I don't want to sort of focus on that too much. What I will say relating to the C word again, we won't really find out the impact of the services side of things until people are actually moving again. You know, we got the date yesterday from the PM, the 21st of June. I think that sort of June, July time will be a really critical time for services sector, because that's when people will actually want to go out and start meeting clients face to face, do business face to face. That's when we'll see the real hurdles. And again, it's very, from my understanding, it's very sector specific in terms of what you are doing with your individual service. So it's unfortunately, again, a wait and see, but I think the second half of the year will be when we cross a few more hurdles on that side.
It's a brilliant segue into bringing Andrew in to talk about employees, but Rebecca, I saw you nodding. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I think I just echo what James has said. I think in terms of what we're seeing, you know, businesses that we're speaking to, you know, they're very much waiting and ramping up. They're talking about, you know, how are we going to manage with our supply chains, all of the import export side of things we've just talked about, because what they're forecasting is that when we do hit kind of June, July time, you know, they're looking to stockpile again, getting ready for this in the services sector. Equally, you know, outside of some of those kind of services businesses, lots of our clients still remain in the City of London. I could talk about my office, but I don't want to give away too much. But, you know, I don't think there's any kind of risk that we will move away from being office based to some extent. So I would just echo what James has said.
No, and I think that's an interesting debate for everyone at the moment. And I'm not going to use the words new normal. We've managed to go this far without mentioning COVID. We'll try and avoid other COVID cliches. But I want to talk about employees now, and Angela's on to help us through, because clearly COVID has masked some of the issues around free movement of people. Anyone in the leisure sector has not really been going anywhere at the moment, certainly not to work. So I wonder, Andrew, just your reflections on some of the challenges people are facing in terms of access to human capital, and also some of the things that you think might unwind as we come out of lockdown.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So just to kind of summarise where we're up to as well with the immigration front, because free movement has now ended. So that ended on the 31st of December. Now, just to backtrack slightly and say that, you know, although free movement ended, for those EU workers who were already resident in the country before the 31st of December, or on or before the 31st of December, they can apply for the EU settlement scheme, which you'll have seen in the press. You know, it's not been a particularly smooth journey, but it does seem like more and more EU workers have now applied for that scheme to formalise, legitimise their stay in the UK beyond the 30th of June. So that's where, you know, a lot of EU workers, they are getting their EU status, EU settlement scheme status, whether it's settled status or it's pre-settled status. So there is a good number of EU workers in the country that we can still rely on to get the work done, essentially. And they've got until the 30th of June to apply for the settlement scheme. The problem really comes when we're talking about those EU workers who have come here after the 31st of December, when we've got the new points-based system in place, because they can no longer, as I said, free movement has ended. They can no longer rely on the old rules. And if they are wanting to come into the country to work, then they will be treated in exactly the same way as non-EU nationals. So whether you're coming from America or you're coming from Spain, it's the same rules apply under the new points-based system that, again, you'll have seen or read about in the papers. Now, the points-based system is difficult to navigate, in the sense that, you know, free movement was so easy. It was so easy to recruit an EU worker, and that ease has definitely gone for those people who are coming here now. And also, it doesn't help with the supply of what we see termed as lower skilled or lower paid workers. So if you're wanting, particularly in hospitality sector, people to wait on tables, if you're wanting in the care sector, you know, you're wanting care workers to come into the country to carry out care work, that's where my clients are really seeing the hit. and there isn't a solution. The points-based system is for highly or medium skilled workers. There's minimum salary thresholds, there's minimum skill thresholds, they've got to have a certain level of English language, and so there isn't a magical solution for the clients that I'm seeing who need numbers, you know, the bulk of EU workers that they've come accustomed to having over the past number of years where we've had free movement. So that's where I see the biggest problem. If for those clients who are wanting a higher skilled worker to come into the country, the points-based system does work, and it does work very well. The employer would need a sponsor license to bring them into the country to do the work. And again, it's, you know, there's a lot of formality with it, but it does get those highly skilled workers into the country. So there are options available, but it won't help you with the supply of lower skilled or lower paid workers that, as I say, we've come accustomed to having over the past years.
And one of the things that interests me is obviously a big part of the Brexit debate was the opportunity to trade more widely and enter into free trade agreements with other countries. And I'd be interested in your views and anyone else's on some of those conversations with access to markets in places like India and China. I presume they're going to come with requests from them to open up our employment market to their nationals. Is that something that you see as an opportunity, a challenge? What are you hearing from clients in respect of those sorts of issues?
Yeah, so from an immigration angle, I'm already seeing that barriers are being removed. So as I said earlier, the new points-based system treats employees, EU nationals and non-EU nationals the same. It's actually made easier for non-EU nationals. So for example, those coming from India, if we're talking about the India trade deal, the potential for it, it's actually already easier to get Indian nationals into the country under the new points-based system. And that's because the skill level's slightly lower than it was previously for non-EU nationals. There's now a post-study work visa, which appeals to a lot of Indian nationals who've come here to study and then want to stay beyond that time. So I'm already seeing that the barriers to those trade deals are being removed. And who knows, yes, we could have specific arrangements in place like we have with Hong Kong to get those workers into the country much more easily.
So it may be that people actually, start having been familiar with the sort of the EU workers being on tap, start looking further afield potentially, and we might just see a slight change in that. It's interesting. James, I guess part of your in your role in the discussions you're having with government and the rest of it, it's probably worth just maybe touching on the trade deals. Should we just forget about them for 8 or 9 years? Are they going to come and save us? Is Donald Trump going to come back with a nice juicy trade deal? Is this just a red herring, or is it something that we just have to ignore for the time being?
So I think it's an interesting point. I think almost the TCA puts in a false sense of security, because we only started negotiating that last January, February, and we got it by December. Trade deals traditionally take years to get done, certainly comprehensive trade deals. It's fair to say there was political will on both sides in this instance to get this over the line in short order. I think it's fair to say, though, that whilst the rollover trade deals have helped, and there's certainly talk of other ones, I don't think we can. I mean, I'm not the international trade expert at the CBI, but I don't think we can expect the US trade deal to be imminent. I think people will be sort of taking a bit of a step back politically on that one. But I think trade deals are great, and businesses should look to see what's happening with them. But I think that shouldn't stop businesses looking elsewhere for opportunities around the globe. And I don't think firms should be sort of constrained by where the trade deals seem to be going.
And Rebecca, are you? I mean, obviously with the client base of KPMG, I mean it's a global firm with global clients. Is there any shift in sentiment from your clients around, actually, do you know what, maybe we do need to look at markets which traditionally were a little bit more inaccessible? Are they suddenly looking more attractive now?
Yeah, we have clients that are looking to source elsewhere. And I think it goes back to the question you probably posed at the very beginning. So when you look at mapping your full end-to-end supply chain, we always have this kind of rule of thumb. So the first and foremost is always understanding the commodity code, because if it's 0% GC, then effectively, irrespective of where you're sourcing from, it's probably okay. When you then start to think about manufacturing, rules of origin, you start to look at those kind of complex rules. You then also get to a decision around, do I need to source somewhere else? The kind of the Nissan example is great in terms of understanding that. I think the other point is probably around the quality of what people need, governance about where you're getting product from. So there's lots of different drivers in terms of why businesses are starting to look for kind of different sourcing models. But ultimately, it does normally come down to the rules of origin. So I know they're complex, but they're all country specific as well, just to point that out as well.
Funnily enough, we haven't had any questions so far, and I suspect there's one or two people maybe just delighted that we're answering all their questions already, but I also suspect after this call there'll be a few people going and Googling a few terms, and maybe even some people on this call, because it does sound to me like there's a huge amount of issues here that I think SMEs in particular, may well struggle with. So I'm sure some of the guys that are on today will have questions. Please feel free to send them through. We'll try and answer them if we can. But similarly, I completely understand if you're sort of hiding under your duvet at the moment, thinking, I just hope this all goes away. Rachel, I want to come to you now because you've got a specialism in data protection and done a lot of work. And I just wonder, was GDPR the great last European harmonisation project? What's happening with that is because that is the one sort of flag bearer of EU legislation in recent years. Are you going to tell us that there's a whole load of other issues arising from us leaving the EU as a result of data flows?
Hi, Richard. Thanks. Yeah, you're right. The GDPR was a big piece of news when it came in a few years ago. And I thought it would be helpful to have just to think about what's the same now post Brexit and what's changed in this respect. So the GDPR is a regulation of the European Union. So strictly speaking, it doesn't apply in the UK now. However, the UK government has effectively transposed it into UK law with the Withdrawal Act. So they've made some changes to it, but just changes for sense, really. So the short answer is that GDPR does still apply in the UK, but now we call it the UK GDPR. It's been slightly changed. So, for example, if it talked about a member state, it would now say the UK. So the regimes are the same for the moment. So all the things that you did to prepare your business for compliance with GDPR, putting into place accountability principles, all the data subject rights that you have to have a process for and honour, all your privacy notices which had to comply with GDPR, all the lawful processing grounds, they're all the same, and the regimes are essentially identical. Also, under one thing that's the same, and this is a kind of an important issue, I think, when you talk about data protection post Brexit, is transferring personal data outside of the European Union and the UK. So previously, of course, in the same way that we had free movement of people, we had free movement of data. So you could transfer personal data within the EU, and you didn't need to take any extra steps to worry about that. Now, that is the same for now because of the trade deal. So what the EU and the UK government effectively agreed is that for a period of time, those data transfers of personal data from the EU to the UK could carry on as they had before. But this is a temporary measure, and it can only last up to the end of June. And the purpose of that is to give the European Commission time to consider whether or not to grant the UK an adequacy decision. Now, countries that have been granted an adequacy decision, it's where the European Commission has looked at their laws on data protection and said, well, those laws are so good and they give so much protection to people and their personal data that we're quite happy for there to be a transfer outside of our kind of gold standard of the European Union and GDPR. So the European Commission at the moment is having a look at the UK and deciding whether or not to grant us that sort of decision. And this is one of the things that we were talking about a lot pre-Brexit, was what were we going to do about these transfers from EU to UK? But the trade deal did address that for now. So that's kind of what stayed the same. So fundamentally, the regime is the same, but there are some things that have changed. And of course, the most obvious one is that while the laws at the moment happen to be identical, that isn't going to be the situation going forward. So over time, they can diverge. So if at the moment you've got some processing which is subject to UK GDPR, and you're also caught by the EU GDPR, which obviously has extraterritorial reach, then you could find yourself having to comply with two regimes going forward, whether it's because they get amended or whether there's case law on it through the different courts. So that's just something to think about and to keep your eye on, I suppose, if you're in an organisation where that's going to be relevant to you. And of course, now that the UK isn't part of the European Union, the government of the UK has got a lot more independence about what to do when it comes to data protection. So within the EU, only the European Commission could grant an adequacy decision, for example, whereas now the UK can do that itself. So for the moment, all of the adequacy decisions we already had under from the EC are still, you can still rely on them. So if you want to send personal data to Canada, for example, you can still rely on the EC adequacy decision to do that. But going forward, the UK government can do its own. And I think we'll see what happens with this, because certainly I think if you have a look at the different supervisory authorities across Europe, the ICO, I think, has always been seen as quite business friendly compared to some of the others, and particularly somewhere like Spain, which is seen as much more kind of on the side of the data subject. I think I'm fairly safe in saying that. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of approach the UK and the ICO takes to using those new powers that it's going to have. I mean, some people might be familiar with the fact that we don't have Privacy Shield anymore, which that allowed us to transfer personal data to the US, and it was brought down in a court case. But when we talk about a potential US trade deal and the ICO, it'd be interesting to see whether or not that's something that the UK government starts to look at to kind of resurrect that ability to help data flow freely between those countries.
No, thanks. I mean, it's just, isn't it? Data is an asset, and for many companies, the most important asset. So again, just probably another example of another area where people are going to have to just be alive to it. We've actually got a question. And I'm almost sorry that I provoked it now, but Colin Shelmore has asked the question. Now, Colin, I don't think we've got any VAT experts on the call, but I'm going to ask the question, and we'll see if anyone can at least do. I suspect Rebecca will know someone who could probably answer the question if she had time. But so Colin's question is, if my company has to register for VAT in an EU member state, does that mean we have to file quarterly returns as here in the UK? Rebecca, it's an unfair question if you're not a tax accountant, but I just wondered if you or anyone else has got a response for Colin on that one.
The answer is yes. It depends on member state in the EU, and it depends on thresholds. It depends on how you might be providing services in the EU if you're importing. This goes back to probably, we mentioned before, contracts and Incoterms. So what we did see in the run up to Brexit was people start to think about VAT obligations. So if you are importing into the EU and then you deliver to a customer, then yes, you'll need to be VAT registered. Like I said, it'll be different per member state based on thresholds. And then equally, if you hold stock in the EU and then you want to make intra-community supplies, you'll have to do intrastat reporting. And again, it might be monthly, it might be quarterly. So effectively, it is the same as how you were doing it in the UK. But if that's an issue administratively, it might be worth looking at your Incoterms again to see a tweak to that could change things.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a GDPR question as well, Rachel, and I am conscious as well that we're going to lose James in about 10 or 12 minutes, so I'll move on shortly. But Rachel, Steve Worrell's asked, what happens when UK data is managed on servers beyond the EU's borders, such as cloud server providers?
Yeah. So I'm not sure this has changed too much, but I suppose similar to what Rebecca said earlier about mapping your supply chain out. This is really what you need to have done with your personal data flows. So, for example, in that question there, Steve, if you're subject to the UK GDPR there and you're keeping your data on a cloud server which is outside of the EU, then you need to have a contract in place with that cloud server to legitimize that transfer of data. Now, at the moment, you would use the standard contractual clauses plus a risk assessment, because since the Schrems judgment, they're probably not okay, not enough by themselves. And that's that. So you would need to have that sort of protection in place, unless, of course, the country that they're stored in. It doesn't say in the question there, but if it was in a country that's already subject to an adequacy decision, then you would be okay relying on that adequacy decision. So with a cloud provider, you probably have a data processing agreement in place with them anyway. That's what the GDPR and the UK GDPR requires. But as an additional step, if they're in a country which isn't subject to an adequacy decision, you're going to need to protect that transfer in another way. Probably most easiest way to do that is with standard contractual clauses.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. James, conscious that you've got to go and probably to speak to someone very senior in government at 11 o'clock, but we won't ask what you're doing. I'm sure it's more interesting than what I've got coming up next. But I'm conscious of a couple of things. One, how damn difficult all this stuff is, and one, while everyone's got an appetite to get it right, we've already had sort of 45 minutes. So I just want to try and move the conversation on a little bit. We've not talked about Brexit really as much in the last 12 months as we had in the 5 years before. And I think the feeling is that actually now everyone is waking up. Brexit and COVID seem to be the two big topics of debate. I'd just like to ask you, before you go and follow up with the other panelists as well, you know, what other things do you think we should be talking about other than Brexit in the context of our businesses, and perhaps give some insight into that?
I mean, as much as I'd love to stop talking about Brexit, I think we will be talking about it for a bit longer yet, maybe not in the same terms as we had to. One of the big things actually is COP26, which is coming to the UK at the end of this year. Big opportunity for businesses there. We're going to have Joe Biden hopefully coming across. It's going to be a big global gathering looking at innovation, tech, new ways we can do things, and actually it's a really good opportunity, especially for SMEs, to look at where those opportunities are. And I guess that links into my earlier point about, you know, don't just focus on where the trade deals are, look at where the opportunities are around the globe, and everything else will hopefully flow into that. So that's definitely one big thing I think to look forward to this year. Otherwise, I don't think the bandwidth is there for much else, I'm afraid.
Brexit and COVID is then, but no, that's great. That's great. Well, James, hang around for a bit longer if you can, but whilst we've got you on, I'd like to thank you for your time this morning. I think we might get a few more minutes out of you, but if you disappear, thanks ever so much, and we really appreciate your input. I'm going to go to Angela as well on this one. I'm sure in your world there are sort of lots of things on your desk that aren't purely related to Brexit. What do you think we should be thinking about or talking about outside of Brexit in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so I think, and forgive me, it's slightly related to Brexit, but I promise I am moving away from it. I think, excuse me, I think we're definitely going to see a change in the way employers are recruiting. So this is this kind of softer side of employment law that I'm involved in. And I think there's definitely going to be more, as I said, more changes in the way we recruit. And the reason for that is obviously net migration is falling, and you know that was the reason, part of the reason that Brexit went ahead anyway. And I think employers in the UK are going to have to think a lot more creatively about how they make use of the settled workforce, so the UK labour force. And, you know, in order to do that, especially with what we've seen in how people have worked flexibly over the last 12 months, how people have worked remotely, I think, again, that there are advantages to be taken there. I think we're going to see more, for example, term time only contracts being issued to suit people's particular, you know, home, you know, childcare issues that they might have, for example. So term time only contracts, school hours contracts. So I think the way in which employers recruit is going to change quite significantly, and partly by COVID and the impact that that's had, but also because of Brexit as well, and the fact that we haven't got the EU workers that we had in previous years.
Great, thanks, Angela. John, over to you. We haven't heard from you for a little while. Everyone's still sort of working out rules of origin, but yeah, you've got a broad practice area in terms of commercial contracts and other issues. So again, you know, same question to you really. What else do you think we should be talking about, worrying about?
I think the big issue the big sort of structural issue, which has been motoring on regardless of Brexit, and which obviously COVID put rocket fuel under, is the shift online. We're seeing that really picking up speed, both with big retailers who are really moving a lot of their customer sales online, and also SMEs as well, throughout multiple sectors who have operated traditional bricks and mortar models and are now very quickly transitioning to online sales. So obviously that has a lot of effects, the significant effects in terms of obviously the high street and what we're seeing there, and it'd be interesting to see what the regulatory and tax response to that is. There's a lot of talk at the moment about online sales taxes for multiple reasons. One of them being the concern, obviously, around monopolistic behaviour by the large suppliers, who are clearly the big winners from COVID, but also they've been in a very good position to leverage their advantages. So we're seeing, even, for example, large retailers, etc., they're having to work with the existing suppliers, the Amazons and the others of this world. So yes, I think that will continue at pace.
Rebecca, again, I mean, you know, in your practice, I'm sure, you know, this is just one of a number of things. So, and I'm sure it may be Brexit related, but, you know, what do you think you're going to be talking to people about other than Brexit in the next few months?
I think we'll always talk about Brexit. Do you know what? I think outside of that, we have started to see an increase in kind of conversations around the ESG agenda. So there's a whole raft of different things that businesses, and again, product, supply chain, sector specific, the conversations that we're having. But certainly when we're starting to think about shortening supply chains, let's say, all of those types of changes from the tax world has impacts. That example I gave at the very beginning about transit, for example, you know, if you think about the journey it's taken, I've got clients that take probably 4 or 5 different member states before they get to their final destination when there are direct ship routes available. And to change those supply chains does have a tax impact in terms of who's importer, exporter, where do you need VAT registrations, etc., etc. So we are starting to see conversations around that. Equally, looking at things like changing people's packaging, so how they're actually shipping goods, what's it made of, the material, and again, going back to kind of the tax world, that equally might change the classification of goods. So looking at duty rates. So all of these things you start to take into consideration. So ESG combined with things like people changing their buying habits, so where you're kind of sourcing from, distribution centres, and it all just kind of plays one big supply chain mapping exercise that I know we keep saying, but it's so important to do in order to make those right decisions.
No, thank you. So it comes back to that. No, I mean, I'll get Claire and Rachel to you before we finish. I mean, I'm a corporate partner here, so, you know, my input in a lot of this conversation has been fairly passive, but what I will say in terms of transactional appetite, that certainly we've seen anything tech related has been very much in vogue at the moment, and we've seen a lot of activity in that sector. If you can do something remotely digitally, it's massively attractive, and certainly we've had a number of transactions in our team along those lines where, you know, large companies have been trying to find solutions, whether it be from an ESG perspective, whether it just be from an efficiency perspective, might even tie in with Angela's point about sort of flexible workforce. So certainly in the corporate world, tech is really, really in vogue. Rachel and Claire, before we wrap up, anything that you'd like to add? I've come to you last, so you may well have all been exhausted, but if you've got anything that you think, you know, some perhaps different topics of conversation for us, other than, you know, homeschooling and not being able to go to the pub?
Well, that's the best news story, isn't it, at the minute? The kids are off back to school, literally rejoicing all night. And I'd like to give quite a positive spin on where I think we could be going, because I think although we've identified obvious challenges with Brexit and very obvious challenges, I think the other point that has been raised is the fact that it does bring opportunities. People get quite inventive. There's lots of resilience out there. And I've seen quite a lot of that actually in the way that John's talked about, the way businesses have modified quickly to move themselves online. Another place I've seen that is the collaboration between two completely different commercial entities that possibly wouldn't have had the conversation but for COVID could do in this particular climate, and work with people that could help them out with that, basically. So I'd really like to see that sort of collaborative spirit continue actually over the coming years. We've obviously seen it high profile with the farmers and the universities collaborating across all sectors of society. I think it poses really interesting opportunities for people.
Rachel, have you got a positive note to end on, or are you going to drag us back into despair customs forms? And
I mean, just to stick to, I mean, I can't really add to what Claire has said on the kind of the trade side, I suppose. But in terms of the data protection, to be perfectly honest, most of the questions I get are how do we comply with the law? What do we need to do? But I do, and this is probably speculation a little bit on my part, you know, will we see different regimes sort of start to develop over time on data protection between the EU and the UK, or just a different approach to enforcement? Based on the fact, as I said earlier, you know, the ICO always has been seen as more business friendly than some of the others. And I noticed, I read in the press recently that I think Facebook had transferred all its UK user agreements to California away from Ireland. And the purpose of this apparently was to so that Facebook would avoid the EU, you know, the GDPR regime. And I found this a little confusing because at the moment the laws are exactly the same. So perhaps they know something that we don't. Perhaps
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
Exactly. But there could be some opportunity that way. I mean, you know, the Information Commissioner is very, very keen to stress that good data governance and opportunity and innovation should go hand in hand. So I suppose it's just a case of watching this space really and seeing how that starts to take shape, especially thinking about, you know, a potential trade deal with the US, I suppose.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think resilience has been a feature of most of our clients over the past 12 months. It sounds like they're going to need to carry on in that frame of mind. It also sounds like we're probably going to have to do a few more of these over the months and years ahead. I think what I've taken from it is that there are opportunities, there are challenges. We don't have the answers. You need to make good friends with your advisors and also start to make sure that you're thinking about, you know, the systems that you've put in place in preparation for Brexit might need tweaking. But just like to end by thanking everyone for joining us. Thanks for everyone who's tuned in. Thanks for the questions. James has gone. It's great to have his perspective. And Rebecca, thank you very much as well for taking the time to join us. This is going to be recorded, so will be available for others to download. I'm sure if you'd like to get in touch with any of the panelists, if you can't find a way through Google, let us know. If there's something we can do to help introduce people, we'd always happy to do that. There is a series of online events from Naptons continuing. I have forgotten what the new ones are, but I'm sure they're on our website, including some bite-sized webinars that can mean you don't have to sort of watch me looking at the wrong screen, for which I will apologise. I probably need to work out my camera angles a little bit better for the next one. But for me, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks everyone for participating, and we'll look forward to chatting again, hopefully in a few months' time, where it'll all be resolved and everything will be back to normal. Thanks very much. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.